It was a quiet evening in the heart of the city, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like nothing could possibly go wrong. But in the shadows, danger was lurking. A criminal gang, known for their ruthless tactics and brazen confidence, had been terrorizing the neighborhood for weeks. They thought they were untouchable, that no one could stand in their way. But they were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget, one that would come from the most unexpected place. Enter Maya, a strong, determined black woman who had just moved into the area. She kept to herself, always seen walking her two large, well-trained dogs, Max and Shadow. To the untrained eye, they were just pets, big, intimidating, but harmless. But Maya knew better. She had a secret, one that even her closest neighbors didn't know. Max and Shadow weren't just dogs. They were K9s, highly trained and fiercely loyal. Maya had spent years working with them, and they were more than just companions. They were her partners, her protectors. The gang, however, didn't see Maya as a threat. They saw her as an easy target. She was new, alone, and seemingly defenseless. What they didn't realize was that Maya had a sharp mind and a plan. She had been watching them, studying their movements, and waiting for the right moment to act. She wasn't afraid of them. In fact, she was ready to take them on. But she also knew that sometimes, the best way to fight back was to let your enemies underestimate you. One night, as Maya was walking Max and Shadow, the gang decided to make their move. They cornered her in a dimly lit alley, their faces masked, their voices dripping with arrogance. They demanded money, threatened her, and laughed at the idea that she could do anything to stop them. But Maya didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes locked on theirs, and in a calm, steady voice, she said, "You've made a big mistake." Before they could react, she gave a sharp whistle. In an instant, Max and Shadow transformed. Their playful demeanor vanished, replaced by a focused, almost predatory intensity. The gang froze, their confidence wavering as they realized these weren't ordinary dogs. Maya's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You thought you could intimidate me? You thought I was defenseless? Think again." The gang leader, trying to regain control, took a step forward, but Max let out a low, menacing growl that stopped him in his tracks. Shadow moved to flank them, cutting off any chance of escape. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your heart race and your palms sweat. Maya's voice was calm but firm. "You have two choices. Leave now and never come back, or find out exactly what these dogs are capable of." The gang hesitated, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the situation. But just as it seemed like they might back down, one of them reached for a weapon. Maya's eyes narrowed, and she gave another whistle. What happened next was a blur of motion. Max lunged, Shadow followed, and the alley erupted into chaos. The gang, once so confident, now scrambled to get away. But it was too late. Maya's K9s were in control, and they weren't letting anyone go without a fight. As the dust settled, Maya stood in the middle of the alley, her dogs by her side. The gang was gone, but she knew this wasn't over. They would be back, and next time, they might not underestimate her. But Maya was ready. She had Max and Shadow, and together, they were a force to be reckoned with. The question wasn't whether the gang would return. It was what would happen when they did. The night was quiet again, but the calm was deceptive. Somewhere out there, the gang was regrouping, plotting their next move. And Maya? She was already one step ahead. But even she couldn't predict what would happen next. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle was far from over. What would the gang do when they realized they weren't just dealing with a woman and her dogs, but a woman and her canine partners? The answer would come soon enough, but for now, the tension hung in the air, thick and unrelenting. The story was far from over, and the next chapter promised to be even more intense. Maya stood in the alley, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Max and Shadow sat at her feet, their ears perked, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The gang had fled, but the silence they left behind was heavy, almost oppressive. Maya knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She knelt down, running her hands over Max's and Shadow's heads, murmuring quiet words of praise. They had done their job perfectly, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. As she walked back to her apartment, Maya's mind raced. She had moved to this neighborhood hoping for a fresh start, a place where she could leave her past behind. But it seemed her past, or at least the skills she had acquired, had followed her. Years ago, Maya had worked as a canine handler for a specialized unit in the city. She had trained dogs like Max and Shadow to track, apprehend, and protect. It was a job she had loved, but it had come with its own set of dangers. When a particularly brutal case had left her questioning everything, she had walked away, taking Max and Shadow with her. She thought she was done with that life. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The gang had been a growing problem in the area for months. They operated with a boldness that suggested they had no fear of consequences. Break-ins, muggings, even assaults, they had left a trail of fear in their wake. The police were stretched thin, and the community felt helpless. Maya had seen the fear in her neighbors' eyes, heard the whispered conversations at the local grocery store. She had told herself it wasn't her fight, that she had left that world behind. But deep down, she knew she couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not when she had the skills and the partners to make a difference. That night, as she unlocked the door to her apartment, Maya's thoughts turned to the gang leader. He had been the one to step forward, the one who had tried to intimidate her. There had been something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe, or curiosity. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more about her than he let on. Had they been watching her? Had they known about Max and Shadow all along? The thought sent a chill down her spine. If they had been targeting her specifically, this wasn't just a random encounter. It was a message. Inside her apartment, Maya locked the door and double-checked the windows. Max and Shadow settled into their usual spots, but their alertness told her they were still on edge. She grabbed her laptop and pulled up the local news, scanning for any reports about the gang. There was nothing new, just the same stories she had been reading for weeks. Frustrated, she closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. She needed more information, but she didn't know where to start. The police were no help. They were overwhelmed and under-resourced. And reaching out to her old contacts wasn't an option. She had burned those bridges when she left the unit. The next morning, Maya decided to take a different approach. She needed to understand the gang's motives, their patterns, their weaknesses. She started by talking to her neighbors, carefully, probing for information without revealing too much about herself. Most were hesitant to speak, their fear of retaliation keeping them silent. But one elderly man, Mr. Thompson, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, was willing to share what he knew. "They've been getting bolder," he said, his voice low as they stood on his porch. "Used to be they'd stick to the outskirts, but now they're right in the middle of everything. And it's not just about money anymore. They're sending a message that they own these streets." Maya nodded, her mind racing. "Do you know who's leading them? Anyone in particular I should be aware of?" Mr. Thompson hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before answering. "There's a guy they call Viper. He's the one calling the shots. Young, ruthless, and smart. Too smart for his own good, if you ask me. He's got a crew, but he's the one you need to watch out for." Viper. The name sent a shiver through Maya. It matched the cold, calculating demeanor of the man who had confronted her in the alley. She thanked Mr. Thompson and promised to be careful. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Still, the sensation lingered, a prickling at the back of her neck that told her she wasn't alone. That evening, Maya decided to take Max and Shadow for a longer walk, hoping to clear her head and gather more information. She stuck to well-lit streets, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of trouble. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. It felt like the calm before a storm. As they turned a corner, Maya noticed a group of men loitering near a parked car. They were trying to look casual, but their body language gave them away. She recognized one of them, the man who had reached for a weapon in the alley. Her heart rate quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to show fear. Max and Shadow sensed her tension, their bodies stiffening as they walked past the group. The men watched her, their eyes following her every move. One of them muttered something under his breath, and the others laughed. Maya kept her gaze forward, her hand tightening on the leash. She knew they were testing her, trying to see how far they could push her. But she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. When she got home, Maya locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. She was in over her head, and she knew it. The gang wasn't going to back down, and neither was she. But she couldn't do this alone. She needed a plan, something that would give her the upper hand. As she sat down at her kitchen table, her eyes fell on a photo of her and Max and Shadow from their days in the K-9 unit. They had been a team then, and they were a team now. But this time, the stakes were personal. Maya pulled out a notebook and started jotting down everything she knew about the gang. Their patterns, their hideouts, their leader. She needed to find a way to hit them where it hurt, to disrupt their operations and send a message of her own. But she also knew she had to be careful. One wrong move, and things could spiral out of control. As the hours passed, Maya's plan began to take shape. It was risky, but it was the only way. She would have to draw them out, to make them think they had the upper hand. And when they least expected it, she would strike. But even as she finalized the details, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of her mind. What if she was wrong? What if she was walking into a trap? The night stretched on, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of Max or Shadow shifting in their sleep. Maya stared at the notebook, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. She knew what she had to do, but the cost of failure was too high to think about. The gang was dangerous, and they had already shown they weren't afraid to play dirty. But Maya had something they didn't: loyalty, courage, and two of the best partners anyone could ask for. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Maya closed the notebook and stood up. She had made her decision. The next move was hers, and she was ready to make it. But as she looked out at the quiet streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that the gang was already one step ahead. The tension was building, the pieces were in place, and the game was about to begin. The only question was, who would come out on top? The morning sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood, but Maya felt no warmth from its light. She had barely slept, her mind racing with plans and what-ifs. Max and Shadow were already up, their keen senses picking up on her restlessness. She fed them, her movements mechanical, as she mentally rehearsed the steps of her plan. It was risky, but it was the only way to turn the tables on the gang. She couldn't wait for them to make the next move. She had to strike first. As she prepared for the day, Maya's thoughts drifted to Viper, the gang's leader. There was something about him that didn't add up. He wasn't just a thug. He was strategic, calculating. The way he had looked at her in the alley, it wasn't just anger or arrogance. There was curiosity there, maybe even a hint of respect. She wondered if he knew about her past, if he had done his homework on her. If he had, that changed everything. It meant he saw her as a threat, not just another target. And if he saw her as a threat, he would come at her with everything he had. Maya decided to dig deeper. She needed to know more about Viper, his habits, his weaknesses, his connections. She started by reaching out to an old friend from her K-9 unit, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. It was a risk, but she had no other choice. When she finally got through, the conversation was brief and tense. Her friend, now working in private security, agreed to look into Viper but warned her to be careful. These guys don't play by the rules, he said. If they find out you're digging, they'll come after you hard. Maya thanked him and hung up, her stomach in knots. She knew the risks, but she also knew she couldn't back down. The gang had made this personal, and she wasn't going to let them win. As she left her apartment, Max and Shadow by her side, she felt a strange sense of determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her neighborhood, for the people who had been too afraid to stand up to the gang. Her first stop was the local community center, a place where people gathered to share news and support each other. Maya had avoided it since moving to the neighborhood, not wanting to draw attention to herself. But now, she needed allies. She walked in, her dogs drawing curious glances from the small group of people inside. A woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached her. "You're new here," she said, not unkindly. I'm Clara. What brings you in? Maya introduced herself, careful not to reveal too much. I've been hearing about the gang causing trouble, she said. I want to help, but I need to know more about what's going on. Clara studied her for a moment, then nodded. We've all been affected by them, she said. But most people are too scared to talk. They've got eyes and ears everywhere. If they think you're causing trouble, they'll come after you. Maya leaned in, her voice low. I'm not afraid of them, but I can't do this alone. I need to know who they are, where they operate, anything that can help me stop them. Clara hesitated, then gestured for Maya to follow her to a quieter corner of the room. There's a man, she said quietly. His name is Eddie. He used to run with the gang, but he left after things got too violent. He's been laying low, but he might be willing to talk to you. Be careful, though. If they find out he's helping you, they'll kill him. Maya thanked Clara and left the community center, her mind racing. Eddie could be the key to understanding the gang's inner workings, but reaching out to him would be dangerous. She decided to wait until nightfall, when the streets were quieter and she could move without drawing too much attention. As the sun set, Maya made her way to the address Clara had given her. It was a run-down apartment building on the edge of the neighborhood, the kind of place where people kept to themselves. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a long moment, it opened a crack, and a man's face appeared. He looked wary, his eyes darting around before settling on her. Who are you? He asked, his voice rough. My name's Maya, she said. Clara sent me. I need your help. Eddie stared at her for a moment, then opened the door wider. You've got guts coming here, he said. But if you're looking for trouble, you've found it. Maya stepped inside, Max and Shadow close behind. The apartment was small and cluttered, the air thick with the smell of cigarettes. Eddie motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. I need to know about Viper, she said. Everything you can tell me. Eddie's expression darkened. Viper's not someone you want to mess with, he said. He's smart, ruthless, and he doesn't forgive. If he thinks you're a threat, he'll take you out. No questions asked. Maya crossed her arms, her gaze steady. I'm not afraid of him, but I need to know how he operates. Where does he go? Who does he trust? What's his weakness? Eddie hesitated, then sighed. He's got a soft spot for his sister, he said. She's the only person he cares about, but she's off limits. If you go after her, he'll come after you twice as hard. Maya filed that information away, her mind already working on how to use it. What about his crew? She asked. Are they loyal, or are there cracks I can exploit? Eddie shook his head. They're loyal to a fault. Viper pays them well, and he makes sure they know what happens to traitors. You're not going to turn them against him. Maya nodded, her thoughts racing. She needed a different angle, something Viper wouldn't see coming. As she turned to leave, Eddie stopped her. Be careful, he said. Viper's not the only one you need to worry about. There's someone else pulling the strings, someone even more dangerous. But I don't know who it is. Maya's stomach dropped. If there was someone above Viper, someone even more powerful, that changed everything. She thanked Eddie and left the apartment, her mind spinning. The stakes had just gotten higher, and the game had become even more dangerous as she walked home. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Still, the sensation lingered, a constant reminder that she wasn't safe. The gang was out there, waiting, planning, and so was she. When she got back to her apartment, Maya sat down at her kitchen table, her notebook open in front of her. She had a lot to think about, a lot to plan. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about taking down a network of criminals who had terrorized her neighborhood for too long, and she was ready to do whatever it took to stop them. But as she stared at the blank page, a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if the gang already knew what she was planning? What if they were one step ahead, waiting for her to make the first move? The tension was building, the pieces were in motion, and the battle was far from over. The only question was, who would strike next?